Good evening, everybody. My name is Martha Cole, and I'm the Outreach and Interpretation Program Manager at the Montana Historical Society, and we are absolutely delighted to have John Shontz presenting to us today. 4 generations of his family worked on the Milwaukee Road in Harleton. He did not follow in that tradition professionally. Instead, he spent his career as a natural resource attorney, and he also served in the Montana House of Representatives. But he has clearly maintained that connection, and he has created many, many presentations and written books and articles. And among his published works is Taft, the story of the St. Paul Pass Tunnel and America's Wickedest City, building the Hiawatha Trail, which is for sale over in the corner, and everyone has a bookmark, and he'll be signing after the program, and that is also the basis of his talk tonight. So please help me welcome John Shontz.
See if my mic is working. Is it? Great. So I am a Milwaukee Road brat. Excuse me. And it's interesting because in Helena, we don't think of this railroad very much. It never served Helena. It never served Kalispell, but it served the entire rest of the state of Montana. Went bankrupt in 1980, left Montana in 1985. And this story is about the people at Taft, Montana. How many of you have ever stopped for coffee or Coke at Taft? There's a sand shed there, that's about it. How many of you have driven over through the main street of Taft? Everybody raise your hand, because it's true. It's true. And like the sign says, always something doing at Taft, Montana. Let's see if I can get this going here. So the title of our program tonight is Iron, Buckles, and Bullets. Oops, wrong direction. There we go. We dedicate this to Butch Jacobson. Butch passed away in January. He was a very passionate historian, had file cabinets full of stuff about Taft that nobody in the world else had. We also want to thank Harry English. When the Milwaukee Road built this 30 miles of railroad we're going to talk about, they hired this young man to document the construction of it. And from 1907 through 1915, he took photographs. He died in 1923 in a car wreck, and all of his work went to the winds. He spent 3 years hunting down Harry's photographs. 3 here, 6 there, private collections, public. We could not have done this without Jeff Malcolmson at the Montana Historical Society. And there is Harry on his horse with his camera, and down here is his dog, Dennis. And this is the camera that Harry used. Very, very early film camera, 3x5 format. We are actually found about 100 of his negatives, which is pretty impressive. So my question, where the heck is Taft? Well, the red line here is I-90 and the old Northern Pacific Railroad branch line from Missoula to Wallace, Idaho, over Lookout Pass. So as you drive Superior, Haugen, Saltese, Taft is the last interchange before you start going up Lookout Pass, and it says Taft, and all that's there is a big parking lot and a sand shed. But the eastbound lane of Taft goes right over the top of Main Street. So we've all been there many times. At what, 75 miles an hour? This little section right here is very important. Taft was 2.5 miles from what's called East Portal. The yellow is where the Milwaukee Railroad ran, kind of to Saltese and then along the Northern Pacific, and then it went south like this onto Avery, Idaho, south of Coeur d'Alene Lake, through the Palouse to Tacoma. So kind of keep that in mind. This little stretch of road becomes very important to this story. And by the way, East Portal is, of course, where if you've ridden the Hiawatha Trail, You get off at Taft, you go up this Forest Service road now to the east portal or the east entrance of a 1.8 mile tunnel. So that's, and Taft, Montana was labeled America's wickedest city in a Chicago newspaper in February 1909. And I think it's worth hearing what this man had to say about Taft. And I will tell you, if you're old like I am, Gunsmoke, Wagon Train, Tales of Wells Fargo, all that stuff that Hollywood made up, we have it documented that it all happened at Taft. So here's what he said. These two towns, Taft, Montana, and Grand Forks, Idaho, vie with each other in wickedness. Liquor of the vilest kind is sold. Women of the lowest order ply their trade in every quarter. Creatures in the form of men who share their wages of sin loaf around the roulette wheel and the faro layout. Gamblers sit always at the table trimming the suckers in their brace games of stud poker and cleaning them with loaded dice. Always the harsh voices of the painted Jezebels are importuning the men to buy. If the victim succumbs to these slimy wiles, he sinks deeper and deeper into the mire. The poisonous fumes steal through his brain, his head whirls, his eyes are staring and bloodshot. The harpy, who is clinking glasses with him, makes an advance to another human animal, and the two beasts fly at each other's throats. Somebody knocks over a lamp with a chair. Someone shoots out the other light, and the whole cage of rum-crazed animals seethes and rolls and sways in a frenzy of passion. Guns, knives, bottles, anything that can cut or bruise comes into play for weapons, and the fun is on. Fun? Oh yes, this is the way your primitive man takes his play. Sometimes he is robbed of this pleasant diversion. A luring arm entwines his neck, a once fair hand plants a caress upon his cheek, and then if he is not watching, the other hand, it slips a drop of two of chloral in his glass. It doesn't take long for the knockout drops to do their work, and your confiding child of nature slips into unconsciousness, and her gentleman confederate pinches his wad. In the vernacular, he has been rolled. It is sickening to pry around this hellhole. It makes you feel dirty and soiled just to look at it, and if you want to get out of it and away from it, you do so as soon as you can. This is what this man wrote in the Chicago paper in 1900 about Taft, Montana. In June of 1908, and this is snow at Taft in the middle of June, very typical. Found 17 bodies in the snow banks. None were ever identified. They had been robbed of not only their identity, but their money and all that good kind of stuff. Pretty typical scene in Taft. Is he dead or is he drunk? Nobody knows, but more likely he's dead on the street. This was a tough place. Founded in 1906 by booze peddlers, and if you go back to that little map, showed the Northern Pacific Railroad where it ran across along I-90 and a branch line from Missoula to Wallace. Taft was the stop on the Northern Pacific where the Milwaukee Road unloaded off trains all of the materials and everything it needed to build its railroad a little bit further south. So Taft was on Northern Pacific Railroad property. And that railroad encouraged the drunkenness and the gambling, et cetera, to slow down the construction of the competitive Milwaukee Road. And it's at Rainy Creek, where Rainy Creek enters the then Missoula, now St. Regis River. So this is a picture of Taft. Only had 3 houses. Never had a school. Did not ever have more than 30 permanent residents, except 500 prostitutes. There was never a church there. And on average, because this town burned down 3 times, there were about 35 saloons in town. See in the middle here? The Tivoli Theater. One of the things about Taft was the men in particular, came from all over the world to work on this project. And they tended to stick together by ethnic groups. Well, the Tivoli Gardens is the 5th largest amusement park in the world today. It's in Denmark. So back in the day, that's where the Scandinavians gathered after their 12-hour shift. This building right here is a boxcar. That was the Northern Pacific's depot at Taft for the entire time the town existed. This is uptown. This is the bright side. And one of the things that about Taft that's important is here's kind of the main street. All the outhouses are sitting up here on the hill. Does a lot for water quality, doesn't it? So this is what was called Saloon Town, and on this side of it is the construction area, the warehouses and offices, etc. This building up in here, we're going to talk about this later, that's the hospital that the railroad built, 75-bed hospital and staffed. Here's Midtown. It's kind of like Manhattan, you know, uptown, midtown. And you can see that the quality of the buildings gets a little dicier as we go further east here, actually. And then here's the low town. And the river's right there. Main Street of Taft. This sign up here says Anheuser-Busch. So even in 1907, in Taft, Montana, this bud's for you. Civilization. There was a drugstore, but the drugstore was primarily the wholesale liquor store in town, and a meat market. Taft actually had a baseball team that played area teams. It had a tailor shop. YMCA was built by the Milwaukee Road as an alternative to drinking in the saloons. And there was a post office. Taft's first fire was in November 1908. The owner of the Arcadia Saloon hired a guy to torch it. 2 weeks before that, he bought a new fire insurance policy on his building. One guy died. Seegers alone, that's the pharmacy and wholesale warehouse. In today's money, they lost over $250,000 in inventory. And this is what it looks like. Here's where the saloon town was. Now, the Milwaukee Railroad, they had all their buildings, their construction, stables, powerhouse, all that was over here. And they had pumps to pump water in case of a fire. So they made sure that the saloon town completely burned to the ground. But they saved their own buildings, which are these up here. There's a cafeteria in the hospital. There's another shot of it, basically. But Saloon Town burnt to the ground. However, 6 days later, we're back in business. And you know, it's really funny because like you look at this building and this building, those are canvas roofs. But, you know, the booze business is the booze business is the booze business. William Rockefeller started this. William Rockefeller and his brother John D. owned the Milwaukee Railroad, which at the time was the most profitable railroad in America. He also owned the Anaconda Copper Company. And the Milwaukee Road ran to the Missouri River, and that's as far west as it came. The owner of the Northern Pacific Railroad and the Great Northern Railroad, James J. Hill, created a monopoly and was charging Milwaukee a tremendous amount of money to haul Milwaukee's freight to the coast, and then raised, when he got control of the Northern Pacific, he raised the rates for hauling the 600-pound copper ingots from Anaconda to Great Falls by 4,000%. So Rockefellers decided it was time to build their own railroad in the West. In ergo, Milwaukee moved west. To do this, they spent $7.8 billion in 2023 dollars. That's, when you think about, put that into perspective, the state's proposed budget, entire budget, including federal, state funding, et cetera, for fiscal year 2024 is $7.1 billion. Just to put the amount of money that went into this kind of in perspective. This is, if you look far in the far side over there, you can see the saloon town. This is the construction town, or powerhouse town. There's a powerhouse right here that provided electricity for drilling in the main tunnel. Northern Pacific hauled over 6 million pounds of coal to this powerhouse over a 2.5-year period of time. Stable for 400 horses, lumberyard, blacksmith, warehouses, etc. And you notice, by the way, in the fire, none of these buildings burnt. This is the interior of the powerhouse. This building, the powerhouse was considered modular, so it was brought in pieces, set up, and then when the project was done, it was taken down and hauled away. These concrete stands that the equipment was on are still there. Again, one of the things that's interesting about this whole project, we're talking about 1908, 1909, in all the hundreds of photographs, nay, thousands of photographs, there's not one photograph of an internal combustion engine, period. It was all done with manpower and horses, primarily. But by 1908, I mean, Henry Ford was selling the Model G. It was a very popular car. But none of that happened here. This is a night or a winter scene at Taft, looking down north, and I-90 runs right through here. 8,000 to 10,000 men there at any given time, 512 women, 500 prostitutes, and 12 good ladies. This is a fairly typical picture of the labor force at Taft. This is in front of the YMCA building, and these gentlemen are from Montenegro. Many of the people that worked on this project, the men, came from Southern Europe. They were hard rock miners there. But you kind of get an idea of their faces. And there were some real characters at Taft. This was one of them. Jay Carr, young guy, 23 years old, came to Taft, built a bar, a saloon, and you can see Carr's restaurant. And if you look at the top, there's a couple of, as he called them, chippies, sticking their head out the window. Saloon, restaurant, dance hall, and house of prostitution. He sold it, his business, 2 months later, or 2 months before the fire. A month after the fire, he built another one. And in December of 1909, he locked it up and just walked away because everybody was gone. The project was done. In the end, he became a very, very prosperous farm implement dealer in Ronan, Montana. Paddy Callahan, he was the law at Taft. And this is another great story. We're writing a book about this man. If you think about born in Ireland, Catholic, Butte, tough guy. You have to amend it a little bit. Born in Ireland, Missoula, Catholic, tough guy. It's the only known photograph of him. So here's the story. In 1907, Paddy Callahan stepped off the train at the Northern Pacific Depot in Taft, Montana. A depot made of nothing more than a boxcar with the wheels removed. 6 rough men were loitering nearby and cast him a menacing glance. Squaring his hat, he approached the group when a large man by the name of Liverpool Jake stepped in his path. Liverpool Jake was well known for the beatings he inflicted on other men. If during their encounter men didn't get out of Jake's way, he would simply knock them down. Callahan, with his 6-foot, 240-pound frame, did not step aside. Instead, he threw a quick punch to Liverpool's jaw, tossed him into the street, leaving the giant with a broken jaw in a puddle of mud. Callahan wiped his fist with a cloth, a fist once declared to be the largest in Missoula County, because in those days, Taft was in Missoula County. The other men quickly dispersed, and the cantankerous town quickly learned that a new deputy had arrived. May, she was there. She was a prostitute, and as the curator of the Mineral County Historical Society, Kay Strombo, said, "This woman could stop a train with a look." And here we have Minnie and Gertie and May. The bottle is a bottle of Pabst Milwaukee beer. One of the things that we're doing with the archaeology of all of this is looking at these photographs and learning about what they had, what they used, what they ate, and what they drank. So Pabst was at Taft. This is one of my favorite photographs, too. Another young soiled dove plying her trade. Then there were a few wives and families at Taft. These were the wives and children of the really senior engineers and managers. So in this photograph is A.E. Griffin, right here. He was the chief electrical engineer on the project. Mrs. Griffin, Countess Filipowicz, gal with the hat on. M.J. Griffin, Count Filipowicz on the far corner. Marjorie, and the young lady in the front, her name was Miss Murray. More about these folks in a minute. These are very typical guys, laborers. And from left to right, it's Denny, Slim, and Huggins. Now look at their boots. The Flathead Trading Company in Taft did a whale of a business selling high-laced, high-ankle-laced boots to the laborers, telling them that they would prevent them from getting bit by rattlesnakes. Of course, at Taft and that whole country, there are very few, if any, rattlesnakes. You know, marketing is marketing, right? This is a stage photograph, but it's kind of interesting. If you look at the guy over here, he's starting to pull a pistol out of his holster. Guy here has got his pistol out. This guy's got his pistol under the table. And you can't see it in this picture, but in his hand he has 4 aces. And this card right here is the 5th ace. This is a bar that was frequented by Germans, because we know that's a German flag in the background. And if you kind of look at it, you'll see it's pretty rough country. This document hanging on the flag is a liquor license for this, is federal liquor license for this establishment. And some of the things we find here are, this is a can of tomatoes. This is a box of Arm & Hammer baking soda. There are various bottles of liquor, but also apple juice, lemon juice, etc., as well as, to say nothing of, Kentucky whiskey. The box down in the corner says Garden City Brewing Company, obviously from Missoula. And there's a sign here on the flag, and that the text on there reads Gold Jack Baseball. Again, just some of the archaeology that we do. And I love the look of the bartender's face when Harry snapped his photograph. And obviously the guy next to him didn't want anything to do with his face being in the picture. And oh, by the way, and again, these are guys that just worked on it. One of the bits of technology that was used here was an electric trolley that ran from the east portal staging area into the tunnel. So that's what you're seeing here. And of course, to run it, all you did was just raise this post up to an electrical line, and it would. And then if you wanted to go backwards, you just turn it over, and this little car would run the other direction. But these photographs truly are 110 years old, and the clarity is pretty darn good. So we were allowed to actually meet these people. The man camps. 10,000 men lived in man camps spread over 30 miles here. Taft was the center of it all. This camp was at East Portal, and it was accommodations for 300 men. Now, the other thing that's important in this photograph is from East Portal to the tunnel ran 1,200 feet under the mountain, east to west. And in the wintertime, they couldn't get materials from the east side over the top to the west side, toilet paper, cans of tomatoes, timbers, men, everything had to move from Taft down that little road to East Portal. So what the railroad did was they built a cable system. That's what these towers are, from East Portal to the top of the mountain, so they could move stuff up. And then it was, of course, wagons and sleds could go down, and of course, there's more than just people picking rock and digging rock. These are the cooks at West Portal at that camp, including the pupper dog. But you know, these are kids. If you really look at them, they're 13, 14-year-old kids. And by the way, for pay, the best paid people on this whole project were called the coyotes. They set the dynamite in blue. They got paid $3.25 a day. And these guys probably got paid about 80 cents a day. This is the East Portal camp. The tunnel sits right up here. Camp is down in the valley. See this line right here? That is the current Forest Service road that runs up and over the top of St. Paul Pass. And again, about 300 to 500 men lived here. As I said, very much ethnic oriented. So the story here is the railroad contracted with a company in Minneapolis called Winston Brothers, owned by three brothers, to build all of this. The middle brother had taken his family on a grand tour of Europe in 1905, met an Austrian count. And when they got the contract to do this, he called the count, or sent him a telegraph and said, "We need 1,000 men." Montenegro is not an agricultural country at all. It has always been hard rock mining, deep mining. So the count sent his son and daughter-in-law and 1,000 men from Montenegro to Taft, Montana to work on this project. And in that group, and this is one of the interesting things about this, we worked very closely with the Montenegrin government on this project. And in groups this size, there's the official leader, in this case, Stanislav Filipovich. And then there's also they call him the king. Cook, janitor, laborer. In this case, Miloš was that person primarily because he could speak English. So he was like the union head here. And it becomes important in a minute. This is a copy of the Count and his wife, and that's their house at Taft. For these two people, this was an American adventure. One of the things that happened was Taft had its version of the OK Corral gunfight. This has all been well documented. Reddy Hayes was a foreman on the railroad, got into an argument with Miloš, the king, killed him in a gunfight up at East Portal. Now, it's 2 miles away from Taft. So the Montenegrins all of a sudden start descending on Reddy Hayes, and Reddy turns and runs like hell to East Portal with the Montenegrins behind him because he killed their king. At Taft, the deputy sheriff, Paddy Callahan, gets on a handcart with Reddy, and they pump themselves to Saltese with about 300 screaming, yelling Montenegrins after them. And Montenegrins, by the way, they didn't use guns. They used knives. So these two guys got to Saltese. Paddy put Reddy Hayes on a freight train to Missoula, told him to go to the sheriff's office and report what happened. Reddy did that. The next day there was an inquest, and Reddy was found innocent of homicide due to self-defense. The Montenegrins, by the way, reached Saltese and threatened to burn the town to the ground in revenge, but they didn't. They swore a blood oath. They buried their king, 1,000 men, in a procession to a bit of flat land up on the hillside. And the next day, they were almost all gone. No one ever knew what happened to them. There were 5 that stayed. Now, this happened in October 1907. July 3rd, 1908, Reddy Hayes was dumb enough to go back to Taft. He did not see the sunrise on July 4th. He was knifed to death. And they never found the guys that killed him. So what did these people build? Well, they built in the air as well as through the ground. And this turned out to be, number one, an engineering feat of construction and survey that is, the survey stuff that was invented here is still used today in Montana in underground mining. And it was the most expensive 30 miles of railroad built in North America ever, period. And money meant nothing, by the way. It meant nothing. So there's 20 tunnels and 30 miles, 2 viaducts, which are steel, 250 feet high, 37.8 miles, up and downhill, dozens of trestles, curves as tight as 10 degrees. Where this man is actually standing in that little outcropping, the railroad ran there when they were done. That's the kind of stuff they faced. Luther Oakes, project superintendent for Winston Brothers Construction. He was in charge of this whole project. And I happened to live on Oak Street. And also, by the way, Winston Brothers, a few years later, did a project for the Northern Pacific Railroad. And where they did the project, the town was named after them, Winston, Montana. This is a part of that 2-mile road. This is Scotty with the pipe. And these are wagons that are heading up to East Portal where they're unloaded and the stuff is put on this cable tram system to the top of the mountain and then hauled down the other side. Kind of rough looking country. Around the clock, by the way. The other thing that's important here is all of this road construction and rail construction was done with basically 2 tools: dynamite and manpower. These guys are building the road that Scotty is on. And all they had was shovels and picks. That was it, and some dynamite. And this is where it is, in the clouds. Taft sits back over here. This will give you an idea of the scale of all of this. These are 3 camp buildings. And if you look down here, see if I can find it here, right here. This is a water cannon, okay? Or a siphon, and it's blowing a stream of water. After these trestles were built, the railroad literally either hauled in fill or washed the mountainside down on top of the trestle. So if you look at this today, it looks like an earthen dam with a railroad track on it, but it's actually a trestle that they just filled in. And this is called the Adair Loop. So Taft is over here. This goes around up through here. This is another example of kind of the scale. So you see there's 4 guys standing on the bottom, 2 guys sitting here, a couple of guys up on the top. This is a trestle. And the trestle is, in railroad language, a structure like this that just sits on the ground. A viaduct is made out of steel and it sits on concrete piles. And you notice really all the safety equipment that they used here. This is the cable tram system. It's not only hauling a timber, it's also hauling 4 guys up the mountainside. And these, the 2 side pictures, when they would cross a canyon with a trestle, they would run a cable line first from generally the west side to the east side of the canyon or the valley. And then all the supplies were transported by this cable and all the workers every day. So working in the clouds, those guys over there are, you know, it's a shift change, and he's just posing for the camera. But this is a machine that was invented by the Milwaukee Road called the Traveler. So rail cars come in underneath it with the load. The load could be picked up by this equipment with a crane brought out and set down. So that's how they would build the girders. The train would just slowly move itself forward. But again, you look at all the safety equipment these guys have. No way I'd do what they're doing. Of course, I'm a coward anyway when it comes to heights. Here's a shot of the Traveler at work. And then just the trestle size you can see. And a lot of these timbers, by the way, came from the state of Washington. The trees in Montana and Idaho weren't big enough to create the timbers that they needed to build the trestle. So they were hauled to Taft on the Northern Pacific Railroad from Washington. Again, just the scale of it. This is the Traveler at work right here. It's just completed this viaduct. And then what they would do is they took the whole thing apart, hauled it to the next site by train, reassembled it, and away it would go. Again, you can see some guys up on the top there. Same thing over there. Here the track laying across the trestle. Again, kind of get an idea of the scale of this stuff. And they built 32 of these. That dynamite blast is called Johnson's Blast. It tore the top of a mountain off. It was 5 miles from Saltese as the crow flies. There was a passenger train in the station at Saltese. It broke every window in Saltese, plus every window in the train as well. Just the shock from it. It threw boulders the size of semi-trucks over a quarter of a mile. 25,000 pounds of dynamite. So the tunnel is a story in itself. It's between 1.77 and 1.8 miles, depending on if you count the snow sheds or not. And they built it from both ends. They started at both ends. They did not have what's called a pilot tunnel. Even today, if you're building a tunnel that long, you dig from the top of each entrance a 4 to 6 foot tunnel until you meet, and then you dig out the rest of the tunnel. They did not do that here. They didn't have time for that. So they built a 28-foot tunnel just right from the get-go. When they met, the two sides met under the pass, 1,200 feet below ground. Their center lines were 1/8 of an inch off from each other. Now I think back of the picture of the guys that actually did the labor. He was the guy in charge of the tunnel, and I'll tell you, he didn't give a tinker's ass butt about safety or life. His job was to get that thing built as fast as he could. And you look in his face, and that is there. It's just simply there. So the survey tool. This is a young man. They used a system that, like I say, is still used today in underground mines in Montana, because you can't use GPS a mile underground. It just, for some reason, doesn't work. And again, so they would dig out the tunnel in layers, actually. The first thing they did was they used Ingersoll Rand drills. They were air pressure drills, and all they did was drill the holes to put in the dynamite to blow the face, 6 feet at a time. But they dug 731.5 feet in 30 days, or about 2 feet 6 inches per day. And they beat the record worldwide that had been established a few years before in Switzerland. And here you can see, there's the top layer, and then here's the middle layer, and here's the bottom. And it's all hand done. And the raucous put in those little carts on track, their ore cars, and pushed out. Very tight quarters. In a very wet job. These are the coyotes. These are the guys at the end who are drilling the holes and blowing the dynamite. And in the tunnel, because of the power plant, they did have, in this tunnel only, they did have electricity. So the photographs inside are pretty good. To stage the meeting and to show the modernist equipment that they used, they brought in 2 of these steam donkeys. And if you look down here, you'll see the faces of the guys that, on the day that the tunnel met. First train through the tunnel, April of 1909. And it's a work train. It's coming from the west to the east. We often think about railroads building east to west. This one primarily built west to east. And this is a crew in a tunnel, one of the smaller tunnels. And the management guys all wore ties. That was a rule. And then their light source was kerosene lanterns. And some of these tunnels were over 1,000 feet long that they were digging in with lanterns. This is a picture of the west side of the tunnel. This is called West Portal or Roland. tunnel face is right here. And this is in the spring of 1909. So snow was an issue. So they built this. This is a turntable, not a roundhouse, it's a turntable, and it worked by manpower only. So an engine could go in, they turned it, usually 8 or 10 men pushed the turntable and reversed the engine, brought it out. And of course, Taft was born to die. It was never meant to be a place of permanence. So this is in probably June of 1909. This is the construction yard. Here's the stable. The powerhouse is here. It's already gone. Tearing down the stable. A lot of these buildings are being torn up. Two things that they left us, though. One is the traveler, which is a railroad thing. But the other thing that we all see every day that was invented for this project is the V-plow. And that's right here. Generally, so a guy, the railroad hired a guy to keep that 2-mile road clear. And this is what he invented to do it, pulled by anywhere from 8 to 16 horses. And it's all with us today, all the way around the world. Every time I go to Smitty's to pick up pellets, there's one sitting right there on the front of a pickup. The hospital. The first hospital was a tent. Then the railroad built a 2-story, 75-bed hospital with surgical suites, a separate morgue, staffed by 5 doctors hired by the railroad. Here's a picture of the 2-story hospital. And I often think when I drive by St. Pete's, how nice their yard looks compared to this one. Dr. Leon Coria was the chief doctor. These other 4 he hired. This man's wife was with him. She wrote a book in 1956 about her experience at Taft. It's called Doctors, Dynamite, and Dogs. And 4 years ago, you could buy her book for $3 on Amazon. Today, if you find it for $450, you're lucky. This just how much interest all this has done. This guy and this guy and this guy never bothered to get a license to practice medicine in Montana, which was required at the time, but they just never bothered. 2 on the bottom actually did, and both had very successful practices in Missoula for many, many decades after this project. Dr. Cora is the guy in the middle. Don't know who the other 2 are. And actually what happened was after Taft, he went back to the University of Syracuse, New York, to do a residency in ophthalmology. Was helping out at a clinic for the poor, contracted an infection and died. 32 years old. Here is Dr. Slusher and his wife Edith. He, after Taft, went to Europe, went to Vienna, and did an internship in orthopedic medicine for 2 years, and then came back to Minneapolis and had a very successful orthopedic practice there for 40-some years. Google's is the dog, by the way. And there is Otto and Edith. And the publisher that published your book is still in business, and they're thinking about republishing it this spring. Edward was the cook at the hospital, and the dog is Gourmet Googles that he's feeding. But Edward, another character. He's just, this place is just full of people like this. For many, many, many years, he was the camp cook for Kit Carson, the explorer in the West. So the hospital closed on April 4th, 1909, after the tunnel was completed. The hospital was cleaned up, beds were made, surgical suites put in order, instruments sterilized, door was closed, they all walked away. And the hospital was then sold for $25 to a lumber salvager. All the records and everything disappeared. The hospital ran the, quote, cemetery, end quote, at Taft, which was a flat piece of ground up above the hospital a bit. Not a cemetery like we think of today with a fence around it and plots. It was just a flat piece of ground that they just buried people in. So in 2018 winter, I was looking for something to write about. I went to the Historical Society, found this 2-page article about Taft, and in there was a sentence that said, there's a 72 grave cemetery. So I called the archaeologist at the National Forest in Missoula, and I said, what do you know about the cemetery at Taft? Now, I did not know her from Adam. She did not know me. She said, we don't have any record of any cemetery at Taft. What the heck are you talking about? But the Forest Service is very good about recording graves and making sure that they're not disturbed. So Erica Shearing got busy, and she was very responsible for getting this whole thing rolling again. So all traces of that cemetery were burned to the ground like Taft was in the Big Burn Fire of 1910. There were no stone markers. If there were markers, they were wood. And of course, that was a very hot fire. It just burned everything. So we started a record search in March, and we formed a search team. There's the Taft interchange. Of course, as John can tell you, that snow shed is gone, collapsed, was it 2 years ago? Yeah, due to snow weight on the roof. So we mapped out a search area a mile deep off the interstate and 5 miles long, looking for the cemetery. Here's Erica Shearing. She was the lead and still is. Bruce is an arborist with the Forest Service. Second field trip is when we found it. We found it because Butch Jacobson is a man that lived in Mullen, read a newspaper article about our first search, called the writer of the article, Kathy Woodford, who's the editor of this book, and said, I know where the cemetery is. So we went up there, and then by that time, Erica had found a metal detector off a national forest, I think, in New Mexico. Pretty high-end stuff. So not only would it click or ding on metal, but if there was an object there, it would tell you what it is. Okay? And that becomes really important. So the first 3 graves, ding, iron. Iron deposit about 6.5 feet long, 2.5 feet wide. And they turned out to be iron from the nails that were made to use the coffins. Next hit, in the middle, a buckle. Next hit, between 2 and 6 inches from the buckle, a bullet. Like I say, Hollywood couldn't make this stuff up. It's just incredible. And there's our leader, Erica Shearing, and her daughter. And at this point, Erica said, we need more help. So she got a hold of Professor Dixon at the University of Montana, Department of Anthropology. And third field trip, Professor Kelly brought a whole group of graduate students and all kinds of equipment. And you'll see her picture in a minute. This young lady is Erica's oldest daughter. She happened to be with us. She found a shard at the cemetery. And it was sent in for examination. It is part of a teacup. It fits perfectly the age and place of Taft. And in other photographs, we have pictures of Edith Schlesinger's tea set. It was hers. So Cora the Sleuth found it. These are the graduate students, and they're digging on points. Many, many graves up there, many graves. But one of the things that was really interesting, I didn't know this, one of the graduate students is a plant anthropologist, and he found several iris plants, and he said they are not native at all. And particularly in southern Europe, they were planted on the graves of people who were poor, particularly women and children. These plants survived the fire of 1910. They mark graves. And as a kind of research into this, iris plants, particularly the Russian or white, will live over 250 years. So these plants have been up there over 110 years, marking graves. And there are 6 of them. We found 4 of them kind of sitting right next to each other. And the odds are more than high that these are graves of women, probably prostitutes. Everything was located. The cemetery at Taft is not, it's open to the public, but you'll never know where it's at. Everything is marked GPS with the Forest Service, and the reason is there's no way to really fence it and protect it and have it guarded. So we've just left it. It's going to be left in its natural state to prevent grave looting. Excuse me. This is what they did, the graduate group. So if you look at the graph over there, there's buttons and buckles and bullets. So where they're grouped, this is a grave. This is a grave. This is a grave. That is. And that's just one little piece of what we believe is the whole cemetery. So 2019-21, the COVID years, were basically years of contemplation, planning, and media engagement. And it's amazing the media that this story generated. New York Times ran an article, December full page, on a Sunday edition. PBS has done Backroads of Montana segment. They are in the midst of preparing a full hour-long documentary on Taft for national PBS. Did a number of regional television shows about this, and it just seems to grab people. So last September, there's a Institute for Canine Forensics in California, and they have dogs that specialize in finding graves of ancient humans. They can't, for example, their dogs, they can't locate human remains that are newer than 50 years. They have to be at least 50 years old. And they offered to come last fall to Taft, and so they did. And there's Kylie the dog, and John, her trainer. He's a PhD, by the way. PBS was there, filmed for 4.5 hours. And I asked him, I said, John, I said, so what's the oldest remains that this dog has ever found? He said, 9,500 years old. San Diego County, California. He said the remains were exhumed and carbon dated. And I said, so what has this dog done lately? He said, well, last spring, the National Geographic Society funded and mounted a campaign to a remote island in the South Pacific and looking for the remains of Amelia Earhart. And I said, so what was the results? He said, well, from our standpoint, it was very positive. That's all he would say. So this is Kaylee, Erica Shearing, our team leader, and the dog is sitting on the grave of the king of the Montenegrins. Amazing. This is Taft after the 1910 fire. A few buildings were rebuilt, but it was gone. This is the cemetery today. And if we have done our job, you get the gist of this without any idea where it's at. But that's what it looks like today. I mean, it's a 100-year-old lodgepole. It's just forest and full of huckleberries. And so one of the questions early on was, do we cut down all the trees and do ground-penetrating radar? And the answer was no. Erica said, that's not going to happen. And we're not going to mark the graves either. So if you're interested in joining an archaeology expedition or two this summer, give me a call. It's a lot of fun. This summer we're looking for some of the original man camps. And it'll be always on a weekend. It's usually a full Saturday. And so we all get to tromp around in the woods and the brush and pick up old cans and shoe horses. In the after years, this is the station at the east portal or east entrance to the tunnel. You see the train coming out. And this was a hallelujah photograph. See this ring right here? That was not there for train orders. That was there to hold a key. Now there are, in this 37 miles, there were like 8 railroad stations. None served a town except Saltese. They were just out in the middle of nowhere. And the way that it worked, in order to prevent head-on collisions, trains through these tunnels and trestles, So a train coming from the west would stop at Avery, Idaho, and the engineer would be given the key. And the agent would literally unlock the tracks with that key and then give it to the engineer. That section of track, 6 or 8 miles, was locked from the other direction. So a train, if it tried to go through where he was at, would derail. And it's called the staff system. And it's still used, particularly in jungle areas and across the globe today. But the Milwaukee Road used it for many, many years here. And so what happened was the agent here would take the key, you can see where the locking mechanism is here on the track right there, and put it in a canvas bag and hang it on there, and the engineer would grab it, or the fireman would grab it in this case, as the train went by. This is the official Golden Spike, and this was driven at Gold Creek on the way to Missoula. But the actual beating of the east and west of the Milwaukee Road happened downtown Missoula, about 2 blocks east of Higgins Street. One of the things about the Milwaukee Road, it never hired Chinese labor. It used a lot of Japanese labor. And a lot of these men and their families stayed after the construction for many, 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 many years. In Harleton, there were 12 Japanese families that lived there. This gentleman, Sam, was one of them, and his son, Jim, and my mother were great buddies. They terrorized Harleton on their bikes. Did it for many, many years. His real name, his Japanese, is Shiro Sataki. So one of my historical connections to this railroad. And again, this is just a list of the stations. This is what a key looked like. So it'd be about that big. And that's what was used to unlock and lock the track on every single section. And every section had its own different key. It wasn't the same key for all of them. Big Burn Fire of 1910, largest forest fire in history. If you look on the far right, you can see a couple of guys standing there. And Taft was, except for 2 buildings, burned to the ground. The Taft Hotel survived and the lumberyard survived. And the Taft Hotel was bulldozed in 1961 to build I-90. So like I say, when we all go to Spokane, we drive right down Main Street. Savinac. How many of you have been to Savinac? Savinac was, it's at Haugen where the $50,000 silver dollar bar is at. Forest Service facility. For many years, it was a massive nursery, seedling nursery. And the Milwaukee Road would pick up seedlings there and deliver them east and west because you could not haul tree seedlings in a freight car. The rocking and rolling damaged the roots. So this is one of the Milwaukee Road's transcontinental passenger trains, the Columbian, picking up a load of yellow pine seedlings at Savinac to deliver to a forestry project in Washington. And again, I apologize for the quality of the photograph, but kind of the best we could get. In 1915, the Milwaukee Road electrified the line from Harleton, Montana to Avery, Idaho. Locomotives did not use diesel fuel, did not use coal, did not use wood. There was a line, you can see it right here, that hung over the top of the tracks. And this catenary would pop up from the locomotive, touch the line, and the electricity through the line would run the railroad, run the train. And then about every 30 miles, there was called a substation built. And this is the substation that was being built at Taft. So on one side of the track was a 100,000 volt AC line that was built by Montana Power Company, which was formed by William Rockefeller to provide electricity for this railroad, specifically. And so this building, the equipment would draw AC power into it, convert it to DC power, and then put it into the railroad line. All railroads in Europe today are based on the Milwaukee Road. They're all electrified. And this was at its height, East Portal. I'm standing about where the tunnel entrance is at to the 1.8 mile tunnel. And there are always 3 cottages that went with each substation because they had to be manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the thing about living up in here, by the way, the families got really high extra pay because in the wintertime, the only way you could get in and out was by train. No roads. And today, if you remember the Hiawatha Trail, if you've been up there, this area is the parking lot. That's the parking lot. The historic Taft Hotel, which bit the dust in 1961. This was the last train that the Milwaukee Road ran through Montana, the Olympian Hiawatha. Bottom shows Mount Rainier. The Milwaukee Road invented the full dome observation car with the cafe underneath it that Amtrak runs today. That was a Milwaukee Road invention. The Hiawatha Trail today, some 70,000 people ride it every summer. In fact, the last 4 years, the number has exceeded 74,000. And it's just an amazing thing. In fact, more people ride it today on bikes and wheelchairs than ever rode it on a train in a year. And that's just the truth.
But it's colder.
A little bit. But although, now, the other side of it, so this goes from East Portal west into Idaho, okay? And that's what it looks like. This is Turkey Creek and Clear Creek trestles. And you can see the bike riders on it, just to give you kind of an idea. And these were the towers where that electric line hung down from that the locomotive drew its power from. The Trail of the Olympian from East Portal, from the parking lot, goes east to St. Regis, Montana. And that is a snowmobile and motorcycle trail today. In a couple of years, it will be a bicycle and wheelchair trail, like the Hiawatha. About 15,000 people ride this trail every year. Amazing number of people are working and have worked on this project, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to Los Angeles, to the Balkans. And I just named a few of them. And the gentleman in the back there, Mr. Axline, his name is deservedly up here. Again, some of the people that were very helpful. Jeff at the Historical Society, and then Gunnar, who was the chief surveyor at Morrison and Merrily, unlocked how they surveyed this tunnel so that they met where they met. This is just fascinating. We got about 3/4 of the way through the book, and we were at a meeting, all of us. There's about 9 people on the team here. And somebody said, well, how did they actually do that? Because we hadn't thought about that question. So we added that. And again, there's just so many people that have helped with this, including the Montana Book Company, the engineering department at Carroll College. And the first press run of the book is technically sold out, so we're working on another one. So thank you for coming.
That was really wonderful. Will you take a few questions?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I will be here till the bitter end for questions.
So, and if you would talk into the mic for your questions, I'll bring it around, raise your hand, because we're taping this, and that way people who are watching it later will be able to hear your questions.
I wanted to know how you knew the one grave was the grave of the king.
Good question. So the graves there are bunched. There's a flat area, and there's a creek that runs on one side of it. All the graves we found were in that one area, except one. And that grave is about 100 yards up the mountainside, so it overlooks the cemetery. And so the speculation to start with was that was the grave of the king, because his people would have buried him up above, looking out over the valley and the cemetery. And that other confirmation there was what he was wearing when he was buried. So, I mean, it's not a slam dunk, sure, but it's 90% that's his grave. And what's interesting about the dog was we knew where about 15 of the graves were located before the dog got there. And John the handler said, don't tell me where they're at. Don't want them marked. Don't want the Kylie to know anything or have any idea about where they are. It took the dog 20 minutes to find the first 12. So it was just an amazing confirmation. But that's how we found it, or identified it. Next question.
What caused the fire in 1910?
I'm not sure anybody really knows. I think the best speculation was that there were 5 forest fires that started, probably by lightning, in the area, and they merged. And that's what caused the conflagration, actually. One of the photographs, for example, that we have that Harry took was about 20 men posing in front of a mine. The picture was taken 2 days before the fire reached them, and all of them died.
Did the fire in 1910 affect the trestles?
The question was, did the fire in 1910 affect the trestles?
Absolutely. And again, there's so much to this story, but what happened was the Milwaukee Road was burned out of commission for about a month. And so a number of trestles were burned. All the facilities that they had, buildings, all burned. It took them a month and several hundred men to kind of creep back into it. And that was one of the reasons that the Milwaukee, they rebuilt trestles and then they really hustled to fill them in with dirt. Yeah, big project. Normally a railroad, like on a project, they would take 4 or 5 years to do that. Milwaukee was all done in like 6 months. And again, for the Rockefellers, money was no object, and for them, safety didn't mean anything. It was just get it done. Questions? Yes, ma'am. Oh, okay.
I heard that during World War II, that line was used to ship silk from the West Coast to the East Coast where they made parachutes.
Prior to World War II. So, starting in about 1890, silk was being imported into the United States from Japan. The silk industry in China had been wiped out because the mulberry trees were diseased and died. So silk was being imported to the United States from Japan, duty-free. And first it went to San Francisco, then on the Union Pacific and railroads east of Omaha to New York City. The Milwaukee Road got into the silk business when 1909, when the main line was completed, because it was the only transcontinental railroad between Tacoma, Seattle, and Chicago. The Northern Pacific Railroad never was a transcontinental railroad because it ended at St. Paul, Minnesota. So did the Great Northern. The Union Pacific ended at Omaha, Nebraska. So freight had to be interchanged, not only by train, but also by railroad, and it took time. The Milwaukee could run a train straight through from Seattle to Chicago, essentially without stopping. Silk trains had an average value load today of about $125 million. 8 cars of silk. And on the railroad, the load was insured by the hour. So the faster, the better. And the Milwaukee Road, over the years, generated most of the silk trade. In today's money, from 1909 to 1941, the railroad made about $10.5 billion hauling silk. And the freight charge, by the way, was 25% of the value of the silk. And that ended in 1941 when Franklin Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in August, prior to World War II. But prior to that, yes, in the Milwaukee Road, on those trains, there were armed guards. The trains, like on a steam locomotive could run about 100 miles before it needed to rejuvenate itself with water, not so much fuel, but with water. So on a passenger train or on a regular freight train, the train would pull into the station, for example, water spout would come down, take them 15 minutes to fill the tanks, et cetera, change the crews. Silk trains didn't do that. There was an engine that was hot to go, waiting. And the silk train would pull in, disconnect its engine, the other, hook up, and away it went. And these were the fastest trains that ever ran in America. They also, everything went, it's called in the hole, in other words, on a siding. Even the cracked passenger trains were put on sidings to let the silk trains through. Just an amazing story. And it was one I got to write about. It was a lot of fun. But the longest stop in the whole Milwaukee system for a silk train was 6 minutes in Hiawatha. They changed crews. They changed from electric locomotives to steam or diesel, actually steam back in those days. But that was the longest stop on the entire route from Seattle and Tacoma to Chicago. And then at Chicago, the locomotive was pulled off, and a New York Central locomotive was put on. The guards and all were still there, and the train went to New York. So it was 54 hours from Seattle to Chicago, 20 hours from Chicago to New York City. And then in New York City, the load was inspected by customs and then distributed to silk mills in the New York and Pennsylvania area. Massive business. And of course, they had to use special cars because silk was like the roots of a tree seedling. If it rocked too much, it would damage the fibers. So the railroads built special cars for silk loads. They were also used for vegetables and to bring housing kits from Chicago out west and glass from Pittsburgh. Yes, does that answer your question? Okay.
I had a couple questions. You mentioned that they did not use Chinese workers.
Correct.
They used Japan. Why?
It has to do with politics. Okay, so in 1905, Congress passed a law, and this is how technical this got. They wanted to ban Chinese laborers from the United States. And in those days, there were labor contractors that would go into China and tell a man, like, if you'll come to the United States, we have a job for you. And you can, so you're guaranteed a job when you get here, blah, blah, blah. So Congress passed a law that prohibited that. In other words, you couldn't hire somebody in China or France or Scandinavia and promise them a specific job. But the law did not address the issue of what if somebody just came without a job. The way around that was, same with the Montenegrins as well as the Japanese. Labor contractors would go into rural Japan and say, we can't promise you a job, but if you come to America, there might be one there for you. So the Japanese came. I mean, it's just technically avoiding that labor law.
Okay, my other question was, is there an estimate of how many people died during the construction of this 37 miles of railroad? And what did they do with the bodies in the dead of winter when the ground was frozen?
Good question. Nobody knows how many people died. Because all the hospital records, for example, were destroyed. But the numbers are in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. What happened for particularly Americans that died, the Milwaukee Road made its best efforts to return the body to home. And a lot of the workers came out of Minneapolis, so they would send them back to Minneapolis on the train or wherever they came from. If they were unable to identify who the deceased was, and that was pretty much the norm, particularly, they were buried at Taft. In terms of what happened in the winter, it's like the slide said, they just throw them in a snowbank until spring. I mean, that's literally what happened.
So we'll take one more question.
I'm curious about the photographer. and where you found information in this archive somewhere. Yeah.
Okay, so Harry English was a Canadian, born and raised in Toronto. Came to Saltese as a young man and set up a photo studio. And then Luther Oakes hired him to document the construction of the railroad. And he took hundreds and hundreds of photographs. What happened was, two of them was, when the Milwaukee Road went out of business in 1980, all that stuff was in their corporate warehouse or offices in Seattle, as far as we know. All of it went to the landfill. All those records were gone. All those photographs were gone. Harry died in a car accident in 1923. He was racing to take photos of the burning of Burke, Idaho, in a forest fire. And a motorcycle ran into him and flipped his car and broke his neck. He never had any children. He'd been married for a couple of years. His wife immediately went back to Iowa, where she was from. His studios, nothing was done with it. So his photographs literally sort of went to the wind. And there were a few, there were like 20 of them in a collection at the Montana Historical Society that we knew about. And so then we just started looking around the Northwest. I think we talked to every local and state historical society. Some would have 10 photos, some would have 2. The Museum of North Idaho had 6. The University of Montana Library had 11. But the treasure was found in 2 places. Luther Oakes' great-grandniece had donated a set of negatives, Harry's negatives, to the Northern Pacific Depot Museum in Wallace. We found those. And the trick there was getting them converted from a negative to a digital image. And I will tell you, the darkroom in Missoula is the only place in the country that does a really cool job of that at a very reasonable price. So Jeff Malcolmson, I kept going up to the Historical Society, and I said, you know, Jeff, we have this rumor that in your collection you have several hundred of Harry English's photographs. So they started looking, found nothing. I kept after them for 2 years. I said, they've got to be here. And they finally found them in 2 albums. At the front of the albums were 50 photographs of Missoula. At the back of the albums were about the same number of photographs in the Flathead Indian Reservation. And in the middle were all these photographs of Taft. Well, they had been miscatalogued, 2 of those. So there were literally several hundred that we found there. And I will tell you that last summer, 90 of Harry English's images from Taft at Christie's sold for, I don't know, $30,000. But that's how we found it. We have 7,000 images. There are 335 of them in this book. We found 900 discrete images, photographs that Harry had shot. So we have enough to do another book at least. So is that? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Everyone, please join me in thanking our speaker.